The battering ram hits the door at exactly 6:47 a.m. Inside the modest ranch house in Teaneck, New Jersey, federal agents find what they expected, $584,000 in cash stuffed into laundry bags. Kilos of pure heroin wrapped in plastic, the crown jewel of the American drug trade. Frank Lucas, the man they call Superfly, sits cuffed on his own couch, watching his empire crumble in real time. But 300 miles south, in the red clay of North Carolina, the real empire sleeps undisturbed. 2,000 acres of silence, 300 head of Black Angus cattle, tobacco barns that hold more than tobacco. And buried beneath that innocent farmland lies a fortune that would make the Vatican jealous. This is the story of the greatest magic trick in criminal history. Most drug lords scream their wealth from penthouse windows. They buy Ferraris with their names on the license plates. They build monuments to their own stupidity. Frank Lucas learned a different lesson. In 1968, when Frank was pulling in $1 million a day from his Blue Magic heroin operation, he sat across from a man who had survived 40 years of federal investigations without spending a single night behind bars. Meyer Lansky, the accountant of the American Mafia, the man who laundered money for Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Bugsy Siegel, the genius who turned blood money into real estate empires. Lansky looked at Frank, this hungry kid from North Carolina who had just bypassed the Italian Mafia entirely, and said 6 words that would define the next decade. Buy a farm, not a mansion. Frank thought he understood. He didn't. Because what Lansky taught him wasn't about humility, it wasn't about staying low-key, it was about architecture, the architecture of invisibility. Annual revenue, million, 365 calls and 365 million, $365 million a year. In 1970s money. Adjusted for inflation? That's billions. But here's the genius. While his competitors were buying gold chains and Rolls-Royces, Frank was buying dirt. Anonymous, untraceable, invisible dirt. The farm wasn't a hideout. It was a weapon. A money laundering machine disguised as American agriculture. A fortress that generated legitimate income while burying illegitimate fortunes. A business that made Frank Lucas not just rich, but untouchable. Until he made the one mistake that destroys every king, he forgot to stay invisible. One night, one coat, one photograph, and suddenly the silent man became the loudest target in America. The feds would spend the next 5 years trying to crack the code of Frank's operation. They would raid his houses, flip his drivers, and freeze his accounts. But the farm would keep its secrets buried in North Carolina soil. The year Harlem burned, the year Vietnam bled, the year Frank Lucas became the coldest man in the hottest city in America. Frank is 38 years old and already half legend, half ghost. The Italians whisper his name in back rooms. The feds don't even know it exists yet. That's how you measure real power. The street knows you. The system doesn't. Not yet. He just returned from Southeast Asia with something nobody in New York has ever seen. A direct pipeline from the Golden Triangle to 116th Street. No middlemen. No mafia tribute. No permission slips. His Blue Magic heroin is 98% pure. The competition is selling stepped-on garbage at 50% purity for double the price. Frank isn't just winning. He's destroying the entire market structure. The numbers are biblical. $1 million a day. Cash. Not revenue. Pure profit. The money comes so fast the rubber bands snap. He weighs it instead of counting it. 35 pounds of small bills equals roughly $1 million. Frank Lucas is weighing fortunes like a butcher weighs meat. But success creates a disease that kills every king. The hunger to be seen. Frank is tired of shadows and side doors. He wants a throne. He's already picked out the palace. $5 million, Alpine, New Jersey, 8 bedrooms, marble columns, heated pool, tennis courts, gates that screen power, his name on the deed. Frank Lucas, property owner. Frank Lucas, legitimate Frank Lucas, king. He's walking through the place with a real estate agent, nodding slow, picturing the look on every Harlem face when they see how far the country boy climbed. From a shack in North Carolina to a palace in Jersey. From nobody to somebody. From invisible to untouchable. He doesn't know it, but he's one signature away from a federal case. Before he can sign, something strange happens. His cousin hands him a folded napkin outside Small's Paradise. No explanation. Just an address and 2 words, Lansky. Tomorrow. Frank stares at the name. Meyer Lansky. The ghost who counts dollars for the 5 families. The accountant of the underworld. A man who made $50 million and left almost no fingerprints. Frank hears Bumpy Johnson's dying voice echoing from that hospital bed. If Meyer Lansky ever talks to you, you don't negotiate. You listen. Frank shows up the next day to a cramped deli on the Lower East Side. Cracked tile. Flickering fluorescent lights. Smell of brine and old bread. No guards, no ceremony, no power. Just a place nobody thinks twice about. There he is, Meyer Lansky, 70 years old. Cheap gray suit that costs maybe $40. Thick glasses, scuffed shoes, a Timex watch. This is the man worth $50 million. This is the genius who survived Prohibition, the Castellamarese War, and 40 years of federal investigations without spending a single night behind bars. He looks like somebody's grandfather eating pastrami on rye. Lansky doesn't stand, doesn't smile, just studies Frank like a chess master analyzing a doomed opening move. You're buying a mansion in New Jersey, Lansky says. Not a question. A diagnosis, $5 million, your name on the deed. Frank nods, proud. Lansky takes a bite of his sandwich and shakes his head. That's how you die. The tension isn't physical, it's philosophical. Lansky isn't threatening Frank. He's performing surgery on his ego. Al Capone had a mansion, Lansky says, wiping mustard with a paper napkin. He died in prison, brain-rotted. Lucky Luciano had a penthouse. He died in exile. Bugsy Siegel had a casino with his name on it. He died in his living room, face full of glass. The pattern is mathematical. Visibility equals vulnerability. The crown makes you a target for everyone. Feds, competitors, journalists, politicians who need a villain. Lansky reveals his secret. I'm worth $50 million. Maybe more. But I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Miami Beach. I drive a 7-year-old Chevrolet. You know why? Frank doesn't answer, but he's listening now. Really listening. The feds can't seize what they can't see. They can't investigate what doesn't exist on paper. I don't own mansions. I own air. I own silence. And because of that, I'm free. Frank's ego fights back. I worked too hard to live like a farmer. Lansky sighs. He's seen this story before. Brilliant men destroying themselves because they can't resist the throne. Then Lansky does something that changes Frank's life forever. He slides a newspaper across the Formica table. New York Daily News. The headline reads, Nicky Barnes, the king of Harlem. There he is, Frank's biggest competitor. Gold chains thick as anchor rope. Custom Rolls Royce, posing like a movie star, smiling like he conquered the world. Lansky taps the photo with one wrinkled finger. That man just signed his own death warrant. Don't be him. Frank walks out thinking Lansky is paranoid, thinking the old man is jealous, thinking the rules that applied to yesterday don't apply to him. 6 months later, Nicky Barnes is under 24-hour federal surveillance. Frank realizes the terrible truth. Lansky wasn't paranoid, he was prophetic. The question is whether Frank learned the lesson in time. Frank cancels the mansion deal with one phone call. No explanation. No hesitation. Just a flat voice cutting through $5 million of dreams, deals off. The real estate agent stutters through questions Frank doesn't answer. The bank that pre-approved the loan will never understand what happened. The neighbors in Alpine, New Jersey, who whispered about some big shot from Harlem moving in, will keep their quiet streets. The palace with marble columns and heated pools evaporates like smoke. Frank hangs up and feels something he's never felt before, the crushing weight of discipline. 3 days later, he's on a small plane heading south, trading Manhattan's concrete canyons for North Carolina's tobacco fields. He's going home, but not the way he left. 20 years ago, he ran from this dirt because it meant poverty. Now he's running to it because it means survival. The red clay looks the same, still stains everything it touches, still holds the smell of rain and old leaves. Frank steps off that plane wearing a tailored suit and Italian shoes, but the humidity reminds him exactly who he was before the money. Nobody. Invisible. Hungry. This time he's keeping the invisible part. Lansky's voice echoes in his head like a broken record. They can't seize what they can't see. The mansion was visible from space. Deeds with his name screamed ownership. Gates and guards announced wealth to every federal agent with eyes. But land? Land can lie. Land can hide. Land can keep secrets buried for generations. Frank starts buying in March 1969, but he doesn't buy like a rich man. He buys like a chess master, thinking 15 moves ahead. No single massive purchase that leaves a trail wide as a highway. Instead, he assembles an empire in fragments. He creates shell corporations with names so boring they're practically invisible: Southern Agricultural Holdings, Piedmont Cattle Company, Carolina Tobacco Partners, Red Clay Investments. Each one sounds like it was named by a tax accountant having the world's most boring day. Frank hires local lawyers. Not mob attorneys with Armani suits and Rolex watches. Country lawyers in seersucker who handle divorces, wills, and property disputes. Men who care more about their retainer checks than asking uncomfortable questions about where cash comes from. The purchases are surgical. 40 acres from a widow who needs money fast. 80 acres from a family farm about to be foreclosed. 200 acres from a tobacco company downsizing operations. Each transaction stays under $10,000. Frank knows the banking rules better than the bankers. 10,000 triggers a federal currency transaction report. 9,900 is just business. By December, Frank owns 2,000 acres of prime North Carolina farmland spread across 3 counties. Total cost, $400,000. Less than 10% of what the New Jersey mansion would have cost. But the value is infinite. To anyone driving past, it looks like nothing. Just another struggling farm in the rural South. A modest ranch house with peeling white paint and a screen door that squeaks. Gravel driveway. No gates, no guards, no signs of wealth. 300 head of Black Angus cattle grazing in fenced pastures. Rows of tobacco plants stretching to tree lines. A few weathered barns that look like they've stood since the Depression. Frank hires local workers. Black men who remember him as that Lucas boy from up the road who left for the big city. They plant tobacco in spring, harvest it in fall. They fix fences, drive tractors, and spread fertilizer. To the community, Frank Lucas is just another man trying to make it in agriculture. Polite, quiet, tips his hat to neighbors, pays his workers on time, shows up at church on Sunday. Nobody suspects the quiet farmer is pulling in $1 million a day from heroin. But underground, Frank is building something else entirely. Behind loose boards in the barn walls, he installs floor safes anchored in concrete. Under patches of innocent-looking earth, he buries waterproof military containers sealed with cash and documents. Each burial site is marked by specific trees only he can identify. No maps, no ledgers, no written records. The blueprint lives in his head. If he dies, the money dies with him. The farm becomes a money laundering machine disguised as American agriculture. The same refrigerated trucks that haul tobacco can haul other products. The same back roads that avoid highway tolls avoid federal eyes. Farm equipment doesn't get stopped and searched like Cadillacs. Nobody thinks twice about a dirty pickup crossing county lines at dawn. Frank files legitimate tax returns, agricultural income from tobacco sales, cattle revenue, equipment depreciation. The farm shows modest profits that justify his lifestyle to the ears. They see a hardworking black farmer barely breaking even. They don't see the empire flowing $10 million annually through the same bank accounts. The system works perfectly. But the invisibility is eating Frank alive from the inside. He's making more money than ever, but nobody knows it. Nobody sees it. Nobody respects it. Up in Harlem, his competitors live like gods. Nicky Barnes throws parties where champagne flows like waterfalls. Guy Fisher drives a different luxury car every week. Frank Matthews is rumored to have $15 million in cash stashed across various apartments. They're on magazine covers. They're legends walking. They're kings with crowns everyone can see. Frank is shoveling cow manure in North Carolina. His wife stares at the peeling wallpaper in their modest ranch house and asks the question that cuts deeper than any federal indictment. Why are we living like sharecroppers when we're richer than the Rockefellers? Frank has no answer that makes sense to someone who wasn't sitting in that Lower East Side deli with Meyer Lansky. All he can say is what the old man taught him: the silent man lives. The loud man dies. But silence has a price. In the streets, that price is measured in respect. Respect is currency. Respect is power. Respect is the only thing that separates kings from ghosts. His brothers mock him behind his back. They see him in work boots and denim, hands dirty from farm labor, and whisper, "Frank went soft. Frank lost his edge." Frank is hiding like a scared rabbit. They don't understand that hiding is the strategy, that invisibility is the weapon, that the farm isn't a retreat, it's a fortress that will outlast every flashy penthouse in Manhattan. But understanding something with your head and accepting it with your heart are two different wars. The test comes in 1971. Frank is sitting in his living room surrounded by quiet luxury nobody can see when he opens the New York Times magazine. The cover stops his heart cold. Nicky Barnes. Three-piece Italian suit. Gold jewelry catching studio lights. Sitting in his penthouse like a pharaoh on a throne. The headline screams in bold black letters, "MR, untouchable." Frank stares at that photo until his eyes burn. This is everything he gave up. The recognition, the fear in people's eyes, the respect that comes from being seen, being known, being legendary. For one dangerous moment, Frank hates his farm. He hates the silence. He hates the 2,000 acres of dirt that hide his genius from the world. He wants that cover. He wants that headline. He wants the world to know who the real king is. He slams the magazine shut and makes the hardest decision of his life. He's going to stay invisible, no matter how much it hurts his ego, no matter how many covers Barnes gets, no matter what anyone thinks. The farm is his insurance policy. Silence is his armor. Invisibility is his kingdom. Frank closes the magazine and sets it on the table. The decision is final. Absolute. He will bury his hunger for recognition in North Carolina soil along with his money. But as he stands to walk away, his hand brushes against something in his jacket pocket. A small white rectangle, a business card, a Manhattan furrier, the man who makes custom coats for people with more money than sense. Frank doesn't throw the card away. He turns it over between his thumb and forefinger, thinking about mink, about chinchilla, about one night. Just one night. of stepping out of the shadows to let the world see the man who owns 2,000 acres of silence and a billion-dollar pipeline of pure heroin. The farm can hide his money. The question is whether it can hide the man from himself. The seed of his downfall has been planted in North Carolina soil, and like everything else Frank buries in that dirt, it's going to grow. Madison Square Garden. March 8, 1971. The air inside the arena is electric with anticipation, thick with cigar smoke, and the collective breath of 20,000 people hungry for blood. It is the fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. Every king, every legend, every somebody who matters is in this building tonight. Frank Lucas walks through the crowd wearing $50,000 of chinchilla fur, and the world stops to stare. The coat moves like liquid power. Floor-length chinchilla with a matching hat that sits on his head like a crown. Under the arena lights, the fur catches and throws back pure elegance. Frank has spent 3 years invisible, buried in North Carolina dirt, swallowing his pride like bitter medicine. Tonight, the hunger wins. Tonight, he is the king he always knew he deserved to be. He sits ringside, closer to the action than the vice president, more elegant than every mafia boss in their $1,000 suits. When Ali and Frazier enter the ring, half the arena watches the fight. The other half watches the man in the chinchilla coat. Whispers ripple through the crowd like wind through wheat fields. Who is that? Where did he come from? Look at that coat. For one perfect night, Frank feels what he sacrificed for invisibility, recognition, respect, the acknowledgement that he exists, that he matters, that he is somebody instead of nobody. The coat makes him visible. The visibility makes him alive. Every lesson Meyer Lansky taught him evaporates in the heat of pure ego. Across the arena, Detective Richie Roberts sits in cheaper seats, watching through different eyes. Roberts is the kind of cop criminals hate, honest, patient, obsessive. He notices the quiet black man in the impossible coat and feels his instincts scream. Nobody wears $50,000 of fur unless they're sending a message. Roberts pulls out his camera. The shutter clicks once. One photograph. One moment frozen in silver nitrate that will destroy an empire. That image lands on a federal task force desk 3 days later, with one question written underneath in red ink: who is this guy? The investigation begins slowly, like water finding cracks in concrete. Roberts traces Frank's movements, follows his money, discovers inconsistencies that make no sense. A man who claims to be a tobacco farmer but drives a Mercedes-Benz. A man who files modest tax returns showing agricultural income but owns 2,000 acres paid for in cash. Shell corporations with names boring as dirt. Transactions that stay just under federal reporting requirements. The feds know Frank is dirty. They can smell the heroin on his money. But they can't prove it. Frank built his empire exactly the way Lansky taught him. In silence, in cash, in dirt that doesn't testify. The farm's architecture is too perfect. No bank records connecting him to drug money, no witnesses willing to talk, no paper trail leading anywhere except tobacco fields and cattle ranches. For 4 years, Frank's system holds. The investigation circles like vultures, but the fortress of silence stands. The feds hit wall after wall of legal fiction, legitimate business, and blood loyalty. They know who he is, but they can't touch what they can't see. So they do what the government always does when they can't break the system. They wait for the system to break itself. In 1975, one of Frank's drivers, a cousin, family, blood, gets pulled over on Interstate 95 with 50 kilos of blue magic in his trunk. Faced with life in federal prison, the man stares at a choice written on paper. Option A, die alone in a cage. Option B, tell us about the farm and go home to your children. The driver thinks about loyalty. Then he thinks about never seeing his family again. He chooses survival. He talks. Back in North Carolina, Frank feels the air change before he sees the evidence. The farm transforms from sanctuary to prison. He can't go to New York. Can't be seen in public. The empire that made him rich has made him a ghost again. But this time, invisibility feels like suffocation. His wife begs him to run. "We have millions buried. Dig it up. We can disappear to Brazil, Colombia, anywhere without extradition." Frank stares at the fields where his fortune sleeps in 55-gallon drums. To run is to admit defeat, to abandon the empire he built from nothing. Kings don't run, they stand and fight, even when the castle burns. He chooses loyalty to his legend over survival. It is the last choice he will make as a free man. January 28, 1975. Dawn breaks cold over North Carolina. Frank is feeding cattle, hands rough from work that used to be cover but became routine. He hears helicopters before he sees them, mechanical thunder rising over tree lines like the sound of Judgment Day. The farm explodes with federal agents. DEA, FBI, ATF, local police. An army descending on 2,000 acres of silence, running through tobacco fields with automatic weapons, kicking down barn doors where heroin once flowed like water. Frank walks out slowly, hands visible. He looks at the ground beneath his feet, knowing $4 million sleeps in the dirt they'll never find. The silent man has one final secret. But as handcuffs click around his wrists, Frank realizes the terrible truth Lansky never told him: you can hide your money in the dirt, but you can't hide from yourself. The farm didn't save him, it trapped him. The coat made him feel alive for one night, but visibility equals death, just like the old man said. Frank Lucas built the perfect invisible empire, then destroyed it by needing to be seen. The dirt keeps its promises. It's the men who break theirs. The chinchilla coat was never just a coat. It was a declaration of war against invisibility itself. Madison Square Garden, March 8, 1971. Frank Lucas walks through 20,000 people wearing $50,000 of liquid power. The coat flows around him like royal robes, catching arena lights and throwing back pure elegance. Under that chinchilla crown, Frank feels what he sacrificed for 3 years of silence, recognition, respect, the acknowledgement that he exists as somebody instead of nobody. Every eye in the building sees him. Every whisper confirms his legend. For one perfect night, Meyer Lansky's lessons die in the heat of pure ego. Ringside, closer to the action than senators, more elegant than mafia bosses in their $1,000 suits. When Allie and Frazier enter the ring, half the arena watches the fight. The other half watches the man in the impossible coat. Frank drinks the attention like wine, feeling alive for the first time since burying himself in North Carolina dirt. The hunger that gnawed at his soul for 3 years finally gets fed. Across the arena, Detective Richie Roberts sits in cheaper seats, watching through different eyes. Roberts is the kind of cop criminals hate: honest, patient, obsessive about details that don't add up. He notices the quiet black man in the impossible coat and feels every instinct scream. Nobody wears $50,000 of fur unless they're sending a message or too stupid to survive. Roberts pulls out his camera. The shutter clicks once. One photograph. One moment frozen in silver nitrate that will destroy an empire built on silence. That image lands on a federal task force desk 3 days later with one question written underneath in red ink. Who is this guy? The investigation begins like water finding cracks in concrete, slowly, patiently, inevitably. Roberts becomes obsessed with the anomaly in chinchilla. He traces Frank's movements backward from the garden, following breadcrumbs that lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Credit card receipts showing modest hotel stays, vehicle registrations for a Mercedes-Benz titled to Shell Corporations, property records revealing 2,000 acres in North Carolina purchased through multiple entities, none connected to a single name. The inconsistencies pile up like evidence that refuses to testify. A man who files tax returns claiming $200,000 in agricultural income but sits ringside at the fight of the century. A tobacco farmer who owns land worth millions but drives luxury cars. Shell corporations with names so boring they're practically invisible. Southern Agricultural Holdings, Piedmont Cattle Company, Carolina Tobacco Partners. Roberts knows Frank is dirty. Every federal agent on the task force can smell the heroin on his money. But knowing and proving exist in different universes. Frank built his empire exactly the way Lansky taught him. In cash, in silence, in structures designed to collapse under investigation without revealing anything substantial. The farm's legal architecture is a masterpiece of criminal invisibility. For 4 years, the feds circle without landing. They put surveillance on the farm but see only legitimate agriculture, tractors moving through tobacco fields, workers loading cattle trucks, a quiet black man who pays fair wages and keeps to himself. They audit tax returns that show modest profits from farming. They interview neighbors who describe Frank as respectful, private, someone who minds his own business. Every door they kick down leads to another locked door with no key. Bank records show only agricultural transactions. Shell corporations protect his identity behind layers of legal fiction. The buried money sleeps undisturbed beneath federal boots. Blood loyalty keeps everyone silent. Frank appears untouchable. But visibility changed everything. That one night in Chinchilla transformed Frank from ghost into target. Every federal agency in America now has his photograph pinned to their wall with one word underneath: priority. The coat made him feel alive. It also made him pray. Frank retreats deeper into the farm, but the sanctuary has become a prison. He can't visit Harlem without risking recognition. Can't be seen in public without triggering surveillance. The empire that made him rich has transformed him back into a ghost, but this time invisibility feels like suffocation instead of strategy. The air around him changes, thick with the weight of federal attention he can feel but can't see. His wife stares at him across their modest dinner table and asks the question that cuts deeper than any indictment. Why are we still here? She knows about the buried money, millions sleeping in 55-gallon drums across 2,000 acres. We can dig it up tonight. Be in Brazil by morning. Colombia, anywhere without extradition. We won. Take the money and disappear. Frank looks out the window at fields he bought with discipline and silence. To run is to admit defeat. To abandon the empire he built from nothing with his own hands and blood. Kings don't run from their thrones. They stand and fight even when the palace burns around them. He built this fortress of silence. He won't abandon it now. The binary opposition reaches its climax: loyalty versus survival. Frank chooses loyalty to his legend over survival. It will cost him everything. The government can't break Frank's system, so they do what they always do: wait for the system to break itself. In late 1974, one of Frank's drivers gets pulled over on Interstate 95 with 50 kilos of blue magic hidden in his trunk. A cousin named Shorty. Family. Blood. The same loyalty that protected Frank for years suddenly becomes his weakness. Robert sits across from Shorty in a windowless interrogation room and lays out the mathematics of survival: life in federal prison. No parole. You'll die in a cage. Or you tell us about the farm and go home to your kids. Shorty thinks about loyalty, the sacred code that binds blood to blood. Then he thinks about never seeing his daughter's wedding, his grandson's birth, Christmas morning. He thinks about dying alone in a cell for a cousin who wore a $50,000 coat to a boxing match while Shorty drove trucks for $30,000 a year. Shorty chooses survival. He talks. The moment Shorty's mouth opens, Frank's empire begins its final collapse, not from external pressure, but from the weight of its own contradictions. The loyalty that protected him becomes the betrayal that destroys him. The silence that made him invisible becomes the testimony that makes him visible to every federal agent in America. January 28, 1975. Dawn breaks cold and gray over North Carolina. Frank is feeding cattle, hands rough from work that stopped being cover years ago and became routine. The cows know his voice, trust his presence. He pours grain into troughs and thinks about invisibility, about silence, about the price of being seen for one perfect night. Then he hears them. Helicopters. Not one, several. The sound rises over tree lines like mechanical thunder, growing louder until it shakes the ground beneath his boots. Frank looks up and sees them coming, black dots against gray sky, multiplying into an army of judgment. The farm explodes with federal agents. DEA, FBI, ATF, local police. 200 men descending on 2,000 acres with automatic weapons and search warrants thick as phone books. They run through his tobacco fields, the same fields that hid his money, his secrets, his legend. They kick down barn doors where heroin once flowed like water. They tear apart equipment sheds looking for evidence they know exists but can't find. Frank doesn't run. Kings don't run. He walks out of the barn slowly, hands visible and empty. Agents swarm him, shouting commands. Weapons trained on center mass. The handcuffs click around his wrists with the finality of a closing book. As they walk him toward the waiting cars, Frank looks down at the ground beneath his feet. $4 million sleeps in the dirt they're standing on. Buried in 55-gallon drums, under trees, marked with cuts only he can identify. No maps, no records, no witnesses. The silent man has one final secret. The feds will seize the farm, freeze his accounts, dismantle his empire. But they'll never find all the money. Some of it will sleep in North Carolina soil forever, waiting for a man who will never return to dig it up. Frank smiles as they push his head down to fit him into the back seat. Even in defeat, he won something. The farm kept its promises. The dirt doesn't testify. But as the car door slams shut, Frank realizes the terrible truth Meyer Lansky never told him. You can hide your money in the dirt, but you can't hide from yourself. The farm didn't save him. It trapped him. Built a fortress so perfect he couldn't leave even when survival demanded it. The coat made him visible for one night. That visibility made him a target for 4 years. And his loyalty to an empire of silence cost him his freedom forever. The silent man lived longer than the loud man. But in the end, both men die in cages. The helicopters lift off, carrying Frank Lucas away from 2,000 acres of buried secrets. The farm remains, quiet and patient, holding millions that will never be spent, guarding the ghost of an empire that conquered invisibility but couldn't conquer pride. In North Carolina soil, 55-gallon drums full of cash wait for resurrection that will never come. Frank Lucas learned the hardest lesson in criminal history. You can build the perfect invisible empire, but you can't make yourself invisible to the man in the mirror. The coat destroyed everything, but the hunger for recognition, that was always going to destroy him. The farm just gave him a place to bury the evidence of his own downfall. 70 years. That was the number hanging over Frank Lucas like a death sentence in federal court. 70 years in a concrete cage for a man who built an empire on freedom and silence. The mathematics were brutal and absolute. Frank was 44 years old. 70 years meant dying in prison, never walking free dirt again, never breathing air that didn't taste like steel in desperation. The prosecutor slid a document across the table. One signature would transform Frank from king to rat. One signature would reduce 70 years to 15. One signature would buy survival at the cost of everything he ever valued. Frank stared at the paper and heard Bumpy Johnson's voice echoing from beyond the grave. The one thing you never do is testify. You can lose money, lose territory, lose your life. But you never lose your word. Frank picked up the pen. He became a federal informant, violating the holiest law of the street code. He testified against corrupt cops from the Special Investigations Unit who had been skimming heroin and taking bribes, against rival dealers who competed for his territory, against some of his own crew who trusted him with their lives. Names spilled from his mouth like water from a broken dam. Addresses, dates, transactions, secrets buried deeper than the money in North Carolina soil. The cooperation reduced his sentence to 15 years. But the cost was everything that made Frank Lucas legendary. Respect, loyalty, honor. In the streets, there's a hierarchy of sins. Murder can be forgiven. Theft can be understood. But testimony transforms you from human into something less. A rat, a snitch, a man without a code. The farm paid its own price under federal forfeiture laws. The government seized 800 acres, the main house, 2 of the barns. They brought backhoes and ground-penetrating radar, tearing apart pastures looking for buried treasure. They found some of it, 55-gallon drums containing roughly $2 million in rotting cash. But millions more slept undisturbed beneath soil the feds never located. Frank never told them where. That was the one secret he kept, even as an informant. The remaining 1,200 acres got divided among different owners, parcels sold to strangers who planted soybeans where Frank once buried his empire. The fortress of silence was broken apart and sold at auction, piece by piece, until nothing remained but memory and hidden money, slowly turning back to dirt. Frank served his 15 years watching the world change through prison windows. The drug game evolved. Crack cocaine replaced heroin. The Italians lost power. The streets he once ruled became foreign territory. Other inmates knew who he was, the legend who broke, the king who chose survival over honor. Some respected the hustle, most despised the betrayal. Released in 1991, Frank was 61 years old. The king of Harlem was gone, replaced by an old man with a bad hip and a shattered reputation. He returned to North Carolina not to reclaim the empire, that was impossible, but to see the dirt one last time. The farm was different now, smaller, divided, owned by legitimate farmers who had no idea they were working land that once held the graveyard of a criminal empire. But the bones remained. The red clay was still red, the air still smelled of rain and old leaves. Frank walked fields where he had once buried his fortune, stopping at tree lines where drums of cash still slept, rotting slowly into compost. He didn't dig them up. What would be the point? The money belonged to a dead man, the Frank Lucas who chose honor over survival, who built an empire on discipline and silence before destroying it with vanity and betrayal. He thought about Mickey Barnes, the man on the magazine cover who chose the throne over invisibility. Barnes got life in prison, became an informant just like Frank, died alone, in witness protection, with a new name and no legacy. The loud man died exactly as Lansky predicted. But Frank lived. He lived to see his grandchildren, to feel sun on his face without bars casting shadows, to stand again on land he bought with drug money and discipline. The cost was his soul. Frank sat on a weathered fence post at the edge of his former kingdom. An old man watching sunset paint the sky over fields that held secrets they would never tell. The farm had become a metaphor for his entire existence, legitimate and quiet on the surface, full of rotten hidden fortunes underneath. Meyer Lansky's voice echoed clearer than ever. Buy a farm, not a mansion. The old Jewish mobster had been right about everything. The land didn't testify, the dirt kept secrets. The farm provided cover that confused the government and preserved wealth long after the empire collapsed. But Lansky had missed one crucial detail. Frank picked up a handful of red clay, letting it crumble through his fingers. Lansky told me to buy a farm because land don't testify, he whispered to the empty field. He was right. The dirt kept my secrets. But I forgot the most important thing, the dirt don't forgive either. Somewhere beneath that peaceful soil sleep the remains of an empire built on silence, destroyed by vanity, and haunted by betrayal. Millions of dollars rotting in metal drums. Power that will never be wielded again. The ghost of a legend who wanted to be invisible and famous simultaneously. Frank Lucas owned the streets, then owned the land, then lost his soul to keep them both. He chose survival over honor, breath over respect, life over legend. The farm made that choice possible. 2,000 acres of silence bought him decades the loud men never got. But the man who walked away from that farm wasn't the man who bought it. That Frank Lucas, the king, the legend, the disciplined ghost who bypassed the mafia, died in a federal courtroom the moment he picked up that pen. The dirt keeps its promises. It holds secrets until the end of time. But it also keeps score. Was 2,000 acres of freedom worth a lifetime of silence? Was survival worth the cost of honor? Was breathing worth betraying everything you believed? Frank Lucas knows the answer. He's lived with it for decades. But the question isn't for him anymore. It's for you. What would you choose? The throne or survival? The legend or the life? Respect or breath? Because in the end, we all face the same choice Frank faced, and the dirt will be there to remember what we chose, long after we're gone. Let me know in the comments.